the Supreme Court's 5-4 on a lot of stuff right now. Even in our state, you know, stuff like this next election is going to decide who controls the House, which last time was 76-74, and whichever party controls the House controls all the legislation. So if you care about something like a sonogram bill, where a woman sees a sonogram, where every woman who goes in for an abortion would have a right to see the sonogram of her baby. That's shown in other states that have passed it. 80% of the women decide not to have an abortion when they see a sonogram of their own baby. I mean, how many thousands of lives would that save a year in Texas? That's what those kind of things decide. You know, how redistricting is done. That'll be really determined ultimately by who's elected governor. So there's a lot of these big things that are really going to be up for grabs, even in our own state. But let me tell you about just a couple updates. I'll try to run through real quick on the things I told you about last time on the federal level, and then give you one more example at the state level. Hate crimes. And the update on that, first to explain so not everybody understands what this is. These hate crimes laws have actually been passed in a number of countries, in addition to places in the United States. You know, it's already a crime to commit a hateful criminal act, okay? So hate crimes is just a nice word to use, really, to put in special extra protections for homosexuals, bisexuals, and lesbians than a regular person has. For instance, if a 22-year-old healthy homosexual is attacked, he would actually get extra protection than if your grandmother was attacked or your 8-year-old child was attacked. It's creating a special category of extra protection. And the problem with these things is, in almost everywhere they pass, within a short amount of time, there's incredible attacks on religious freedom, and in particular on pastors. Aki Green in Sweden, within a short amount of time of theirs, was actually convicted of 30 days in jail for preaching on homosexuality from his pulpit. And 2 different bishops in Canada, within 6 months of their law passing, were prosecuted. And you think, well, those are other countries, that's not the United States. No, in Philadelphia, we had 9 individuals who went to the homosexual OutFest to share the gospel, who were actually charged with up to 99 years in prison for sharing the gospel as a hate crime. And I can give you other examples, there's a lot of them. But I told you a year ago, unfortunately, that it's coming, and it's now a federal law for the United States. Now, when will they start applying this in these types of ways? I don't know. And we're ready for a lawsuit as soon as we get the opportunity. But it's, you know, sort of the bomb is in place now. When they light the fuse, I don't know. But it's there. So it's not good news. And which I told you about, which would force nationwide everyone to accept not only homosexuality, lesbianism, but transgenderism. Which means if your child's teacher in the school, who's a man, feels like he's a woman now, that you can't tell him that he can't go into the little girl's bathroom, that, you know, that would be a violation of federal law. And of course, these ENDA laws, there's no exemption for a Christian business. So if you're a Christian, they're trying to run your business in a moral way. If you're a Christian bookstore, for instance, no exemption for you. And you know, and it has all kinds of other implications. I just got a call. I was driving here today, and I got a call in Memphis. They took this ENDA law that's federal that hasn't passed yet. The only reason it hasn't passed at this point is they have the votes, but they're waiting until they can force the don't ask, don't tell stuff through and make sure that they force, you know, homosexual, lesbian, and transgender in the military. As soon as they finish that, then they're going to ENDA, which would force this on every private business in the country. Well, what happened in Memphis, I think, is a great example of how this stuff impacts everything. They said, well, we'll just take this and we'll apply it to our city employees. In other words, you can't discriminate in employment in the city on these bases. And then a resolution was added that voting on the night that would say that it also applies to anyone who does business with the city or anyone who uses any city facilities. So every church that uses government facilities would now have to sign and have the same policy for their church, or they can't rent or use government facilities like anyone else. So, I mean, how many churches are started by using a local, school or government facility? I mean, it's a very common way that churches get started. So this stuff tends to have huge impacts on religious freedom. And it's evident because if we were, and we've talked about this, we said, well, why don't we just offer an amendment and say, well, an exemption to this law is that we would never want to force the government to force anyone to violate their religious conscience. And of course, the answer is they would never accept that amendment because that is the very purpose of the bill. It's to completely crush your religious conscience and beliefs. So this is unfortunately, absent a miracle of God, this is probably going to go through. But we're still hoping and praying, and we'll see what happens. I mentioned stuff with the Fairness Doctrine, and that's still going on. They're just using different terminology right now, but they're trying to get things through the airwaves, which would have not only a great impact on shows that you listen to, the Rush Limbaughs and things like that. Localism is one of the approaches they're using. In other words, it's like the show has to start from your community, or they won't carry something big that's all over the country. I think it's better to have more local shows. It's a great way to get rid of all the national things that are really big, which are all more conservative. But they would have a huge impact on religious broadcasting as well. That's still going on. There's still a battle there. The good news is nothing's passed yet because there's been such a focus on it, but there are attempts underway. One of the things I mentioned to you is they want to repeal the Defense of Marriage Act, which is unbelievable. I mean, all the Defense of Marriage Act says is in federal law, there's over 1,000 of them, that marriage is defined as a man and a woman, and that you can't have one state create a new definition of marriage and then force that definition on other states by people running to that state, getting married, and then running back. Well, the new administration decided to start essentially trying to lose cases when the gay rights groups filed lawsuits to strike down the Defense of Marriage Act. And they had their first success 2 weeks ago. You're going to think I'm making this stuff up. I'm not making this stuff up. The judge, the federal judge, said that there was no rational basis for marriage being between a man and a woman. Personally, I think the judge has no rational basis. But I mean, that was the opinion. Now, part of the reason that the judge said that is there were 4 different specific bases that the Congress put in the law that said this is why we're defining marriage as a man and a woman for all these federal laws. Things like, we think that marriage actually is a good thing because it leads to more citizens, like procreation, that it provides children with both a mom and a dad, and there were 4 of these different things they laid out. The attorneys from the Justice Department under President Obama were ordered and argued in their brief, as the judge stated very specifically, that the attorneys disavowed the congressional justifications. So it's like your attorney went into court and said, you can't believe anything that he said. And so the court said, and they offered a new one, which was really weak. And the court knocked that one down and said, therefore, there's no rational basis. This violates the United States Constitution, and they struck down the Defense of Marriage Act. That is, I mentioned it last year, that was one of their goals, and they're having success already. And this case is going up through Massachusetts, and we'll go to the Federal Court of Appeals up there. At the same time, there's a case in California you might be aware of where the people of California have actually voted twice now to define marriage as a man and a woman and keep having activist judges overturn that. The last time they passed a constitutional amendment, so it's hard to say that the constitutional amendment is unconstitutional. So what they've done instead is they've gone into a federal court now in California and said that under the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution, no state can have marriage defined as a man and woman because that discriminates against homosexuals and lesbians.